So I'm going to start with a question for Professor Miller. Any specific data on prostate and testicular cancer, similar to breast cancer, but when phone is carried in the anterior pants pocket?
No, as yet, there is no such data. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can indeed.
Okay,
no such
great.
Data. I'm not aware of any data in relation to prostate cancer or testicular cancer. Now, it doesn't mean it won't come, but we haven't had it yet.
Okay, thank you. And another question for you. Are there any studies on Bluetooth exposure via hearing aids? They are worn for several hours every day.
Not that I'm aware. I haven't heard of any. It may be so, but I don't know. Of course.
Got it. Okay. Sorry. I'm reading this is a little bit different, asking you to elaborate a bit more on the 90% increase in cell phone related tumors in young people. I work with young people in education, so very interested in more detail on this subject.
Well, the main cell phone related tumor is, of course, brain cancer. This has increased dramatically in young people. The increase has been documented in many countries, including the United States. And we believe it has to be associated with young people's use of cell phones. One of the problems with young people's use of cell phones, if they start using them very early in life, not only will they increase their risk of getting brain cancer in their teens and early adult life, but also in late adult life. So it's quite likely we haven't seen the full effect of cell phone use yet.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, so questions for Dr. Kardaras. Okay, just a minute. I have a whole bunch of questions here. Are there any studies that compare similar online activities, video games, that compare an Ethernet connection versus Wi-Fi connected computers, devices?
That's a great question. I haven't seen any of that research that delineates specifically between Ethernet versus Wi-Fi. And it'd be interesting to see that, whether there's there's a lot of research that shows an increased aggression effect that happens with gaming platforms. And I'd be curious to see if the Wi-Fi increases the dysregulation and the aggressiveness, but currently I haven't seen any of that research to validate that.
Okay, yeah, I thought that was a really good question too. Okay, these are all going to be for Dr. K. How do you feel about research psychologists' use of MRIs in psychological experiments?
Using MRIs in psychological experiments in terms
I think they're just asking as potentially an intervention, risk versus benefit. I mean, obviously it's an IRB approved thing, so someone thinks it's ethical, but I believe that that's the question.
Well, I do think that some of the research that has moved the needle the most has been some of the fMRI research. I do think that when people began to see that there were physioneurological impacts from screen time, that's when I noticed a big shift over the last 3 to 5 years in both family members and academics. For the longest time, people thought the effects were psychological. And when they started seeing neurophysiological impacts, that's when really people took a step back and became more focused on this issue. So if I had to say, I would say that there is a benefit with some risk, increasing some of the fMRI research, because people look at that as hard data as opposed to maybe some more softer data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It is really compelling to see images in front of your face. Okay, and another question for you. This has to do with the blood pressure, because you mentioned in your talk about the companies that make the video games that they want to see a blood pressure of 180 over 140. Are those really those are the actual blood pressures? So, I mean, and do video gamers have increased were you finding any changes in their blood pressure at baseline? Are there more strokes? Do we know about any of the health issues besides the psychiatric issues?
Right. So we know that gaming has driven, it's been one of the main drivers of pediatric obesity and diabetes. So we know that there's a lot of physiological adverse health effects from being sedentary. The stereotype is that adolescent is that who's more sedentary, more screen-based, is that they're typically more overweight. They typically have, they're not eating healthy diets. The marketing with energy drinks, high sugar drinks, and gaming they're very embedded there together. The thing about reading about blood pressure is it's the adrenergic effect. It's something that is stimulating. So the key for a lot of these gaming platforms, the name of the game for engagement is stimulation. And so the blood pressure gauges were worn by beta testers. They wore galvanic skin responses and blood pressure gauges. These teenage beta testers would test out gaming platforms that would get $100 Amazon cards. And it was really to measure how excited is a person getting. So the galvanic skin response and the blood pressure was a biometric reading of excitement, engagement. Now, I've worked with Dr. Doan. Dr. Doan currently is a captain in the US Navy. He wrote the book Hooked on Games. He's a Johns Hopkins MD who's a recovering video gamer. And he talked about his own use while he was in medical school, that he had gained 50 pounds, his blood pressure was going through the roof because he was gaming 8 to 10 hours a day, and almost flunked out of medical school because of his own gaming. And I find his story pretty compelling because he was a brilliant man who almost lost his academic career because of his gaming, and talked about his blood pressure spiking.
Wow, that is fascinating. Okay, Dr. Baldwin, do we have any questions that have come?
We have a whole bunch here.
Okay, great. So I'm turning it over to you. Can you move the mic closer so we can hear you?
Here we go. Is that better? Can you hear me?
Take it away.
So it's a pleasure to be on with all of you. Tucson is no stranger to mass shootings, mass casualty, and violence as exhibited by Gabby Giffords. And this is a concept that I've had for many years as a practicing neurosurgeon in our community. And can any of you comment towards the lack of empathy that's been developed as a result of immersion in gaming, immersion in devices? Can you speak to that? Because this has been hypothesized, and this may be one way to reach our legislators if we can document this lack of empathy. Of course, now we've seen a decrease in mass shootings because people are not out there, but as soon as we're released, we run this risk of this same population who have now been even more exposed to isolation and electronic devices.
I can say one thing, Dr. Miller, unless you want to say something first, Dr. Miller. I do have some input about mass shootings and young people and their increased aggression and decreased empathy. There's been a lot of research out of Iowa State. Dr. Craig Anderson and his team for the last 40 years have studied increased aggression with increased visual media. And so almost 4 decades of research showing that the more violent content causes increased aggression. Now, increased aggression, it's been debated whether that leads to actual violence. I might be more aggressive, but does that mean I'm going to actually shoot someone? And we can say you're more likely to act violently if you have a higher temperature of aggression. And it's clear that increased violent gaming increases people's aggression. There was a West Point author and psychologist who wrote a book, Stop Teaching Our Children to Kill. And he looked at the correlation, and I can't remember his name right now for the life of me, but he looked at the correlation of violent gaming and shootings. And what we know is that not every video gamer is a mass shooter, but every school shooter and mass shooter has been a gamer. And so there's a correlation there. And there's, I think, some causal research, because I do know that the Iowa State folks did some causal research where they found the increased aggression and also decreased empathy. People are getting desensitized, young people are getting desensitized to violence. They used to say that with cartoons, everything from the Roadrunner to Bugs Bunny, that these were violent cartoons. But I think the difference between modern gaming platforms and violent cartoons was the realism. And so I think that if you're a young person who has a blurry sense of reality because you're so immersed in these hyper real, because the realism is incredible with some of these gaming platforms, especially the virtual reality platforms and what have you. That's not Bugs Bunny hitting Elmer Fudd on the head with a hammer. These are very realistic simulations that are over time wearing down the empathy, and not only wearing down, but I think at pivotal developmental stages, not allowing mirror neurons to develop where empathy and compassion are actually formed. And that's what we're seeing. I've worked with a lot of young gamers who seem to be pretty high on the sociopathy spectrum and don't really seem to have that level of compassion and empathy that we would expect to see.
Thank you. Somebody else asked, what is the best protection and shield to help our kids who are Zooming and attending school from home on wireless devices? Sharon, you have someone at
Sorry, and
home.
I was looking at questions while you were answering. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, what is the best protection and shield to help our kids who are Zooming and attending school from home on wireless devices?
Well, I think that the only evidence-based answer to that is that they need to wire up. That if someone truly wants to protect their child, we understand that wireless radiation has all of these biological effects that we've been discussing over the past couple of days. And really it's Ethernet connection, turn off the Wi-Fi, et cetera, et cetera. Visit the Building Biology Institute and EMF experts booth. And I think they can help with that. That's my answer.
Yeah, well, I noticed in the exhibitors booths, there are options, and this is something that I counsel my patients also about. They want to know what to do, and of course, I do have the luxury of all these wired Ethernet ports, but it is a problem if you have a family of 3 or 4 children and everybody needs the bandwidth. But what is available there to answer that question to help you perhaps is go ahead and figure out a way to get an Ethernet router with at least 4 to 5 wires, and everybody can be on simultaneously with potentially even a faster connection. And there are products now that I think are being advertised here by our vendors that can help with that.
Yeah, and hardwiring a home it's not that complicated.
Right.
So, to hardwire a home for broadband, it's pretty straightforward.
Right. And the
It's
other
just the person
option
has to want to do it, I think.
Right. And the other option is it went in desperation, then Wi-Fi is utilized, but then turned off at night, and it's many people can be on the hardwired connection as possible, and then only use the Wi-Fi when absolutely necessary. Let's see if there's anything else here that is burning question. Some very similar questions from parents who are all concerned about these exposure issues. Does anybody know of an app that can be installed on kids' phones that can automatically turn off Wi-Fi and background data communication and cellular data, except for the ability to make emergency calls or 911, or to receive calls from parents, so that they can actively turn on the capability to browse or call, thus reducing their overall exposure?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But we could get an answer probably from some of the other panelists. Okay.
Well,
what
I was going to mention that the Gabb phone. I don't know if you're familiar with the Gabb phone, which is getting pretty popular with teenagers right now. But there's no Wi-Fi capability on the Gabb phone, and so it's geared. It's supposed to be less radiation because it's not a Wi-Fi platform. It is a cellular network, but it's supposed to be a lower, not only lower from a radiation standpoint, but also less access to problematic types of gaming platforms and portals and apps and everything else that way as well. You can, children can access, I think it has FM radio on it, and it has the ability to text and take phone calls, and that's about it. And it doesn't look like a flip phone, so it's less stigmatizing. It looks like a smartphone without the Wi-Fi.
So it's like a flip phone that looks like a smartphone that's not really a smartphone. Is that what you're saying?
It's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. And what is it called? It's called the Gab phone?
GABB, the Gab phone. They've been
Okay.
around now for about a year.
Okay. All right. Okay. Another question here. Is it helpful to supplement with L-tyrosine because screen exposure increases dopamine? Do you find it helpful to supplement with L-tyrosine when trying to wean patients from excessive screen time? And maybe you could talk a bit about your approach when you, and I don't know if it's a personalized thing different with every patient, but if you use any supplementation or any other approaches for your clients who are it's inpatient, correct? What you do.
Right. Well, it's both inpatient and outpatient. So anything that calms the system. So correct, right? L-tyrosine, magnesium. We're big fans of magnesium. Anything that grounds the system, because typically the person who's habituated or addicted to technology and is doing a digital detox, it looks like a stimulant addict. It looks like a cocaine or crystal meth profile in terms of their adrenal system is overly stimulated. So again, a magnesium tends to work really well. Melatonin for it to get to sleep, their circadian sleep cycle back in its natural cycle. A lot of mindfulness and outdoor nature immersion. Everything from walking on grass barefoot, anything that is grounding, literally grounding. It's almost like we talk about a ground wire. These young folks are typically so up in their energetic levels are so high that we really are doing whatever we can. So avoiding sugary foods, caffeine, all that is avoided. Anything that's stimulating that way is avoided, and anything that can be grounding or calming of the nervous system, from supplementation to activities, are what we kind of layer in there, in addition to psychotherapy and everything else.
Got it. Okay, so Dr. Miller, I have another question for you. If there is no insurance coverage for any of the wireless industries, have there been successful lawsuits by individuals for any form of harm to health, environment, or other claim that you are aware of?
No, I'm afraid I don't. But you're right. There is no insurance coverage. And as people begin to learn more about the hazards, I think that the suits will come. But as yet, I'm not aware of any.
Okay, thank you. All right, and we have this question is for anyone, I guess, do MRIs worsen the symptoms of electrosensitivity? So maybe I'll answer that one. And I'm going to bring up a point that Dr. Mallory Blythe mentioned, which is really important for this conference, which is when we think about ordering tests or doing any kind of an intervention, it really needs to change the management. So the MRIs, when we order them in a population, order them for a person who's electrically sensitive or reactive, I think it really has to change management, and there has to be a good justification for doing it, because I've seen it as a trigger for electrosensitivity. It can worsen symptoms. So I would say yes, it can definitely worsen symptoms.
Okay.
That's Hillel. Do you have questions?
I've got lots of questions.
Because Marianne is with us now too, so you've joined us, Marianne, so we can also ask you questions.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I had some technical difficulties. I just wanted to weigh in for a moment on the issue about children from home. And Nick mentioned that one phone. There is another phone that's coming out this spring called the Mudita, M-U-D-I-T-A. It's an extremely low EMF phone. They've had some challenges with the manufacturing, but it will not have a screen. It will not have, it's not a smartphone. It just has, it has voice and text. Also, for children at home, distance is always important. And so keeping the laptop off of the lap, keeping it a good foot away from the child. One of our exhibitors, Tech Wellness, they have a kit for hardwiring and adapting iPads and iPhones. There's a nonprofit called I Am Living Harmony that sells lap protectors, where if the child insists on putting the gadget on their lap, it's got RF shielding material and magnetic field shielding material. It's not actually a harmonizer. so to speak. And then we have another exhibitor called Shield Your Body that has cell phone shielding cases that are highly effective. So looking at those options can be great for kids, and always with children, making sure that the antennas on the device are turned off that are not needed. So if they're not using the Wi-Fi, if they're not using the Bluetooth, making sure that we have the 4 antennas, just minimizing the 4 antennas on the gadget, just using the ones that's absolutely necessary, and making sure the parents understand this so they can help with those controls.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
I have another question for you that we got. How much should we expect to spend on a building biologist?
So this is a great question.
It is a good question, right? People want to know.
This varies from region to region. Most of us have a minimum of a 2-hour, a 2-hour minimum for a visit. Many of my colleagues charge about $150 an hour. I charge less than that in Asheville, North Carolina. So one of the things that differentiates us from somebody who has less training and less equipment is that we have very extensive training, advanced training. We're using professional equipment. That investment is costing most of us $20,000 to $30,000. So it's really critical that we are able to pay for that investment that we've made. We also, none of us go in and blow in and do a 1-hour assessment. I mean, there are home inspectors now doing this that, they get a tri-field meter and they add it to their regime of things that they do. But for us, we are really meeting the client where they're at. We are explaining the 4 different types of EMFs that we are evaluating, making sure that they can differentiate those, because our goal is that when we leave, they're going to be able to continue to discern how these gadgets and appliances and the wiring in their home, how they are going to be able to manage that into the future. And so a typical visit is at least 4 hours. Sometimes we're there for an entire day. We're doing follow-up. We're coming with knowledge about what's going on in their neighborhood. So we're doing a lot of advanced work. We're doing follow-up. It's a huge investment of time, and it's amazing work that I love.
Great answer. Thank you.
We're getting a lot of questions from our participants about, for Marianne and for Dr. Kardaras, sort of a general to distill at least 5 or 6 questions. And this will be a multi-part question. What would be considered a first step in getting adults and even children to explain away the denial and correlation of their symptoms and EMF exposure and our screen time? Are there resources for adults and adolescents throughout the country, even inpatient programs for gaming addiction? I'll just stop there because, boy, it's coming in fast and furious.
Nick, why don't you start?
Oftentimes when we work with families that are impacted, we talk about in a systems approach, it's the family there's the identified patient typically, but typically there's a lot of work to do with entire families. And then usually the families need some movement in terms of their acceptance of whether it's an EMF issue or a tech addiction issue, but globally there's a problem within that whole family system that needs to be addressed. To answer the last part, and I'll try to do that briefly, yes, there are residential programs for technology addiction. Hillary Cash, Dr. Cash at Restart in Seattle was a pioneer in the movement, and she has the only adolescent tech addiction residential program for 13 to 17-year-olds. The programs that I'm involved with, that I run and operate in Austin, Texas, Omega Recovery and Maui Recovery in Hawaii, we're 17 and older. So typically our clients are 17 to 30 years old. But so there are residential treatment options. And there are sometimes also insurance options as well. The World Health Organization in the latest ICD-11 codes has internet gaming disorder is a diagnosable, reimbursable disorder, although that's not going to go live with the insurance companies until early 2022. But it's been approved as a disorder. And so typically insurance can help in other, there's usually comorbidities that are used for helping out with some of that process. And Marianne, if you want to share whatever.
Yeah, in terms of wireless addictions and denial, some of the faculty here were part of the making of Generation Zapped, which is an amazing documentary that came out several years ago. And for folks that are addicted to their screen, one of the best ways to get them to begin to look at this is to sit them in front of the screen and have them watch that documentary. And then they need the follow-up, they need the coaching from their healthcare providers. And in the toolkit that you've got as part of the conference, a number of us put together a handout called Overcoming Real and Perceived Barriers to Reducing EMF Exposure, Moving Beyond Knowledge and Attitudes to Low EMF Practices. And so what you'll see is a lot of those statements about denial and some helpful ways that you can coach a patient through that. But when we see a patient that we identify as saying, well, I may think about this, or I will think about this, your coaching as a healthcare professional is crucial for moving them through these stages. And it may take a while. And we know that with electrosensitive folks, they're feeling symptoms immediately. And so they are more motivated to change. And yet for somebody that may not have symptoms that are as evident, it may take longer. But again, it's you all engaging them with good rapport and patience and lack of judgment and persistence that's going to help them move through this.
If I can add one thing, there seems to be quite a bit of, we've got quite of a long way to go from a societal denial standpoint. And if I can kind of just, what I've seen over the last 10 years, and I do a lot of public speaking at conferences, mental health or education conferences, people became a lot more comfortable with tech addiction. 5 years ago, people were uncomfortable with technology addiction, and they came around. They saw, it became sort of the undeniable 800-pound gorilla in the room. But yet I find that people are still very much resistant to the electromagnetic conversation. I was giving a talk at Villanova University 2 years ago, and it was a large presentation, 300-400 people. And the university point person who had asked me to speak as part of my presentation, so most of it is tech addiction, but I have a section about electromagnetic effects. And right before my talk, she came up on the stage and she leaned into my ear and she said, "Don't get into that electromagnetic stuff. We're not ready to hear that yet." And I just thought it was really typical of, I think, from a societal standpoint, where we are. I think most people are beginning to realize, yes, these shiny objects have some problems. There's some clinical aspects that are problematic from an addictive standpoint. And I think it's the denial from a societal standpoint is because if we start really realizing how dangerous, because at the end of the day, who cares about tech addiction if we're all going to get various forms of brain cancer? And my 49-year-old sister-in-law died of brain cancer 2 years ago from a really aggressive brain cancer that started right over her ear where she used to put her phone, and her own oncologist refused to acknowledge that there was any correlation with her phone and her brain cancer. And there was no family history of cancer. So both from the medical community, academic community, I think society in general, that conversation is scary to people. And I think they're quite not ready to hear that yet. That's just my own 2 cents of observation. And so I think there's more awareness that we have to raise, and we have to really, that's why things like this conference is so critical, but we have to, I think, reach beyond to the larger society to get them to begin to see what's happening, because I think heads are in the sand over this.